The letter arrived on a Tuesday, blood-stained at the corner and smelling of horse sweat, and from the moment Olive Ramsey unfolded it with trembling fingers, she knew her life in Abilene, Kansas would never be the same again. It was the spring of 1873, and the cattle trails were alive with the thunder of hooves and the shouts of drovers pushing longhorns north from Texas. Abilene itself was a town caught between two worlds, raw and lawless on one side, desperately yearning for civilization on the other. The wooden storefronts along Cedar Street had seen their share of gunfights and heartbreak, and the red dust that settled over everything by afternoon had a way of making even the most hopeful soul feel ground down to nothing. Olive stood behind the counter of Ramsey's General Store, which her father had built with his own two hands 16 years ago, and which she had managed almost entirely on her own for the past 2 years since his health had taken its terrible turn. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair she kept pinned back in a practical knot and eyes the color of creek water in August, a shifting, uncertain green that people noticed before they noticed anything else about her. She was not a woman who thought much about her own beauty, mostly because there had been no time for such thinking. There were shelves to stock, accounts to balance, suppliers to argue with, and a father who needed medicine she could barely afford. The letter was from a land office in Caldwell, a town about 70 miles south, near the Kansas Indian Territory border. Her father, Edward Ramsey, had apparently taken out a small parcel of land years ago as an investment, paying modest dues every quarter. The letter informed Olive that the dues had lapsed, the land was about to be seized, and that if she wished to retain ownership, she would need to appear in Caldwell within 30 days with proof of payment and a legitimate claim to the property. Her father, when she read the letter aloud to him in the small room behind the store where he rested most of the day now, only shook his head slowly against his pillow. "I forgot about that land," he admitted, his voice thin as paper. "Bought it thinking I might expand someday. Olive, that parcel sits right on the Kishom Trail. If we lose it, someone will build a holding pen on it and we'll lose the drover's business entirely. Half the cowboys who come through here stop because I give fair prices and they remember the name Ramsey. Lose that land, lose that goodwill." Olive folded the letter carefully and set it on the small table beside his medicine bottles. "I'll take care of it, Papa." He reached out and caught her wrist, his grip still surprisingly firm. "You cannot go alone to Caldwell. It's rough country between here and the territory line. I know that. Promise me you won't go alone." She looked at him for a long moment, at the gray in his beard and the deep lines carved by years of hard work and now by illness, and she felt the familiar weight of love and responsibility pressing down on her together, indistinguishable from each other. "I promise," she said. Finding a trustworthy escort to Caldwell proved considerably harder than she'd anticipated. Most of the men she knew in Abilene were either too old, too unreliable, or too eager in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable. The town marshal was occupied with a string of cattle thefts that had the ranchers stirred up into something close to fury. Her neighbor, Tom Birch, offered immediately, but Tom Birch had been drinking steadily since his wife left him 3 winters ago, and Olive didn't trust him to find his own front door on a dark night, let alone navigate 70 miles of open Kansas prairie. It was Clara Hutchins, the postmistress, who mentioned the name Wesley Keene. "He's been riding for Holt's outfit," Clara said, sorting mail at the counter while Olive waited for her own correspondence. "But I heard he's done with the drive. They came up from Texas early and Holt paid the men off yesterday. Wesley Keene is a serious man, Olive. Quiet. He's been through this territory a dozen times. And they say he's honest, which out here, you know, is not nothing." Olive found him at the Drover's Rest, one of the 2 saloons in town that had a reputation for being marginally less dangerous than the other. He was not hard to spot. He sat alone at a corner table with a cup of coffee rather than whiskey, his hat on the table beside him, studying a folded piece of paper that might have been a map or a letter, she couldn't tell from across the room. He was lean in the way that a life in the saddle made a man lean, not thin but carved down to what was essential. He had dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that looked like it had been set against difficulties his whole life. She guessed he was around 30, perhaps a year or two on either side. She walked directly to his table because she had learned young that hesitation in a room full of men only invited the wrong kind of attention. "Are you Wesley Keene?" He looked up. His eyes were a surprising shade of gray, like storm clouds with some light still behind them. He did not smile, but there was something alert and measuring in his expression, nothing unkind about it. "I am," he said. He stood up because that was how he'd been raised, she could tell. "My name is Olive Ramsey. I run the general store on Cedar Street. I need to hire a reliable man to escort me to Caldwell and back. Clara Hutchins suggested you might be looking for work now that the drive is finished." He studied her for a moment with those quiet gray eyes. "Caldwell's not a Sunday ride, Miss Ramsey. I know what Caldwell is. The territory line is right there. You get Comanchero raiders coming up through that country sometimes, and the border is a mess of competing claims. What business takes you down there?" She told him plainly, because she had decided already that if she was going to trust a man with her safety on 70 miles of open trail, she would not start by being cagey with him. She explained the land, her father's illness, the 30-day deadline. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he picked up his coffee cup and finished what was left in it, and then he set it down and said, $10 for the round trip plus you cover the horses and supplies. I'll ride a good pace but not a punishing one. We'll take the safer route, which adds a day but keeps us away from the worst of the troubled country." "Agreed," she said, and held out her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm and brief and completely professional, and she found herself unexpectedly relieved by that. They left the following morning at first light, Olive on her steady bay mare named Juniper, and Wesley on a tall, dark roan that moved with a kind of loose, easy confidence that matched its rider. The Kansas prairie stretched out around them in every direction, vast and extraordinary in the early morning gold, the grass already lush from spring rains and dotted with wildflowers that would not survive the coming summer heat. The sky above was enormous. That was always the thing about Kansas that caught in Olive's chest, the sheer size of the sky, so much bigger than anything a person could contain. They rode in companionable silence for the first hour, which Olive appreciated. She was not a woman who needed to fill quiet with chatter. She watched the land and thought about the land office in Caldwell and made careful mental lists of the documents she carried in the leather satchel across her saddlebag. "You know this route well?" she asked eventually, when the sun had climbed enough to warm her shoulders. "I've ridden the Kishom Trail 7 times, Wesley said. South from Texas 4 times, north twice, and once I turned back midway because the weather came in wrong." He glanced at her briefly. "I know this country. Where are you from originally?" He was quiet for a moment in a way that made her wonder if she'd asked something she shouldn't have. "Missouri," he said finally. "Small town east of Kansas City. I left when I was 18. What took you west?" "Same thing takes most people west," he said. "The idea that things might be better in the next place." She understood that so completely that she didn't say anything for a while. She just looked at the horizon and thought about all the places she had never gone, all the years she had spent anchored to Abilene because her father needed her, and the store needed her, and there was always a reason not to leave. Always a good and genuine reason that she had never once resented, but that sometimes, on long quiet evenings, had made her feel like she was standing at a window looking out at a life happening somewhere else. By midday they stopped beside a creek to let the horses drink and rest. Wesley produced hardtack and dried beef from his saddlebag and offered her some with the same matter-of-fact ease he seemed to do everything. She had packed her own food but accepted a piece of the hardtack simply because refusing it seemed unnecessarily unfriendly. "How long has your father been ill?" he asked. He was sitting on the creek bank, hat pushed back on his head, watching the horses drink. 2 years, she said. "His heart, the doctor says. He is not dying imminently, but he is not getting better either. He can work some mornings, easy work, but the heavy work, the managing, that falls to me. And you've been running the store alone for 2 years. It is not so difficult once you understand the accounts, she said. My father taught me well. He always said a woman who understands money is worth 3 times a woman who doesn't. Something in Wesley's expression shifted, a small warming. He sounds like a sensible man. He is the best man I know, she said simply, and believed it entirely. They made camp that first evening in a shallow draw that offered some shelter from the wind, which had picked up from the southwest and carried a faint edge of coming weather. Wesley built a fire with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice, no wasted movement, no hesitation, exactly what was needed and nothing extra. He set up her sleeping area with the bedroll she'd brought, slightly apart from his own, with a natural and uncomplicated respect for her privacy that made her feel safer than any amount of reassurance could have. She lay awake longer than she expected to, not from anxiety, but from the strange electricity of being out on the open prairie under a sky so loaded with stars, it almost seemed to press down on her. She could hear the horses shifting at the picket line, and the distant sound of coyotes talking to each other across the dark miles, and the steady breathing of the fire settling to coals. She had not slept away from Abilene in 4 years. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to have nothing between her and the whole enormous world. In the morning, Wesley was already up when she woke, coffee heating over a rebuilt fire, the horses fed and brushed. He handed her a cup without being asked, still without smiling, but she was beginning to understand that his silence was not coldness. It was something more like steadiness. He was a man who was simply very much himself, without effort or performance, and there was something about that quality that she found more interesting than she'd expected. They rode through the second day talking more than the first. She asked him about the cattle drives, and he told her about them with a dry, precise humor that occasionally surprised a laugh out of her. The stubbornness of longhorns, the particular misery of river crossings in bad weather, the way a whole herd could spook at nothing and have 2,000 animals thundering in every direction before a man had time to understand what had startled them. You love it, she said, listening to the way his voice changed when he talked about the trail. He considered that for a moment. I love the open country, he said carefully. The work is hard and honest, and I understand it. Whether I love it, I think I love that it leaves no room for anything else. When you're on a drive, you have your work and your outfit and the cattle and the weather. There's no space to worry about the larger questions. And what are the larger questions? She asked. He looked sideways at her. The ones a man asks at night when there's nothing else to think about. She nodded. She understood that too. On the afternoon of the second day, when they were perhaps 30 miles north of Caldwell, they came upon a scene that made Wesley pull his roan up sharp and hold up a hand for Olive to stop. A wagon had been run off the trail and had its left wheel sunk into a muddy depression. An older man, stout and red-faced, was struggling to work a jack under the axle while his wife stood holding the horses and looking frightened. They had clearly been there for some time. The horses were lathered and the couple's clothes were dusty and disheveled. Wesley dismounted immediately and went to help without any discussion. Olive dismounted too and went to the woman, who was named Mrs. Carver, and whose fear eased somewhat at the sight of another woman, while Wesley and Mr. Carver worked the wheel free, which took the better part of an hour, considerable swearing from Mr. Carver that he repeatedly apologized for, and Wesley's quiet, methodical application of leverage. Olive helped Mrs. Carver organize their tumbled supplies and soothe the horses. When the wagon was finally upright and the wheel checked and found to be sound, Mr. Carver shook Wesley's hand vigorously and offered him money, which Wesley declined with a politeness that brooked no argument. Mrs. Carver pressed a jar of preserved peaches on Olive, insisting so warmly that Olive couldn't refuse. As they rode away, Olive looked at Wesley and he glanced back at her, and this time he did smile, brief and slightly rueful, as if he was surprised by his own smile. It changed his face entirely, made it younger and less guarded, and she felt something shift in her chest at the sight of it, something small but definite, like a key turning in a lock. "You didn't have to help them," she said. "Of course I did," he said, as if the alternative had never occurred to him, and she liked that answer more than almost anything else she'd heard from anyone in a long time. They arrived in Caldwell late on the second afternoon, the town appearing gradually out of the Kansas flatlands like something being assembled in real time. Caldwell was rougher than Abilene, rougher at its edges, pressed right up against the territory line. There were cowboys in the street from half a dozen different outfits, and the sound of piano music came from two different buildings simultaneously, both badly played. The marshal's office had new boards on its front wall that might have been from a recent altercation involving something heavier than fists. Wesley found them respectable accommodation at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Fuller, who gave Olive a clean room on the upper floor and appeared to assess Wesley in a single sweeping glance and conclude that he was trustworthy, the way experienced frontier women learn to evaluate men quickly as a matter of basic survival. The land office opened at 8 o'clock the following morning. Olive was there at 5 minutes to 8, her documents organized in careful order. The clerk, a thin young man with unfortunate side whiskers and an air of bureaucratic self-importance, examined her papers with the particular thoroughness of someone who has been told to find problems. He found one. "This deed," he said, setting it aside. "It was transferred to your father in 1861. However, the transfer was recorded under the old territorial system before Kansas achieved statehood in January of that year. We'll need a clarification affidavit that confirms the legal continuity of ownership through the state transition." Olive stared at him. "Kansas has been a state for 12 years. "Yes, ma'am, and the paperwork should have been updated at the time of the transition. It was not." "What does this affidavit require?" "It requires a witness who can attest to continuous possession and payment, a property neighbor or a registered agent of the county." She pressed her lips together, thinking, "And where would I find such a person?" "The county surveyor's office is 2 streets over. If the parcel has been surveyed recently, the surveyor might be able to provide a statement, or a local landowner who shares a property boundary with the parcel in question." She thanked him with more composure than she felt and walked out into the Caldwell morning, where Wesley was waiting on the boardwalk with his hat in his hands, having walked her there but waited outside, understanding without being told that this was her business to conduct. She explained the problem. He listened, and then he said, "I know who might help. There's a man named Gideon Hatch who runs a ranch about 6 miles east of here. He's been in this county for 15 years. If your parcel is east of the trail, he'd likely be a boundary neighbor." "How do you know about him?" "We bought cattle from him 3 years ago. He's a straight man." They rode out to find Gideon Hatch, who turned out to be 70 years old, hard as a cedar post, and deeply suspicious of anyone who came to him with what he called paper trouble. But he had indeed had the Ramsey parcel as a boundary property for years, and after examining Olive's documents with the careful attention of a man who had survived the frontier by reading everything 3 times, he declared them legitimate and agreed to come into town the following day to sign a statement. "Your father bought that parcel fair," he said, handing the documents back to Olive. "I remember him. He came out here himself in '67 to walk the boundary. Good man. You tell him Gideon Hatch says to get well." She felt a sudden tightness in her throat that she controlled carefully. "I'll tell him," she said. On the ride back to Caldwell, the late afternoon was wide and golden around them, the prairie grass catching the low sun and throwing it back in waves of amber and copper. Something about the beauty of it after the tension of the day made Olive's careful composure slip slightly, and she rode for a while without speaking, just breathing the sweet spring air and letting the enormity of the land steady her. "We'll get it sorted," Wesley said quietly, without looking at her. "I know," she said. Sometimes I get tired of there always being another obstacle, Another thing to navigate. That's not weakness. That's just honesty. She looked at him. He was watching the horizon with that steady, unhurried gaze, and she thought that she had perhaps never met a person who was so consistently, uncomplicatedly present. No performance, no agenda, no need to be anything other than what he was. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask. Have you ever thought about stopping, the driving, the riding from place to place? Have you thought about staying somewhere?" He was quiet for longer than was comfortable. The horses walked on, their hooves soft in the dust of the trail. "I think about it more lately," he said at last. "I'm 31 years old. That's not ancient, but it's not young for this work either. My knees give me trouble in the cold now. Last winter in Texas, I spent 3 weeks in the saddle through rain, and I thought," he paused, "I thought there must be something better than this. And then the weather cleared and the cattle were moving right, and I thought about nothing but the work. That's always the way of it. The trail takes you back. But the trail doesn't ask anything of you except your body," she said, surprising herself with her own directness. "It's easier to give your body to hard work than to give yourself to something that requires more." He turned to look at her then, and his gray eyes held something she hadn't seen in them before. Something uncertain, which on his certain face was striking. "That's a perceptive thing to say. I've been alone long enough to notice things clearly," she said, and then felt her face warm slightly because she hadn't quite meant to reveal that much. They ate supper that evening at a small restaurant near the boarding house, a simple meal of beef stew and cornbread that was better than expected, served by a Mexican woman who ran the place with quiet competence and who brought them extra cornbread without being asked. The restaurant was lit by oil lamps and smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and outside the windows Caldwell went about its loud, complicated business of being a border town. Wesley poured her more coffee and asked her about the store, genuinely curious, what the accounts looked like, what her suppliers were like, what the biggest challenges had been since she'd taken over full management. She told him honestly, including the parts that had been hard, the supplier who had tried to shortchange her on a shipment of flour, and had been surprised to find that she had kept every receipt and could argue the discrepancy to the last ounce. The cowboy who had caused trouble in the store and whom she had calmly walked to the door and told not to return, while her heart was hammering so hard she could hear it. "You're not frightened easily," he said. "I am frightened," she said. "I just don't allow it to make decisions for me." He looked at her across the table, and something in his expression was very direct, more direct than he'd been before. "Miss Ramsey, Olive, I find you to be a remarkable woman." She felt the warmth move through her chest again, that same quiet turning of something that had been still for a long time. She also noticed that he had used her first name and that she had not corrected him, and that it had felt completely natural. "You are a remarkable man, Wesley," she said, which was plain and honest, and she meant every word of it. The next morning, with Gideon Hatch's sworn statement in hand, the clerk at the land office could find no further objections. He stamped the relevant documents with the particular satisfaction of bureaucratic completion and handed Olive her receipts and a renewed deed that confirmed the Ramsey claim to the parcel in its entirety. She thanked him and walked out into the Caldwell sunlight and stood still for a moment on the boardwalk, holding the documents against her chest, feeling the relief move through her body like warm water. Wesley was leaning against the hitching post, arms folded, watching her face. When he saw her expression, something in his own face eased. "Done?" he asked. "Done," she said. She was smiling. She couldn't entirely help it. He smiled back, that same rare, whole smile that changed his face so completely, and for a moment they stood there smiling at each other in the middle of a busy Caldwell morning like two people who had forgotten they were supposed to be keeping their composure. They began the return ride to Abilene that afternoon, taking the same route north. The weather was better on the return, the sky wide and clear, the spring air carrying the smell of new grass and distant rain. They were easier with each other now, the 2 days of travel having burned away whatever stiffness had been between them at the start. They talked about more personal things, gradually, in the way that two people who have been thrown together in the open country sometimes find themselves speaking more truly than they would in a parlor or a store. He told her about his family, a father who had been difficult, a mother who had been gentle, two brothers he hadn't seen in years and didn't know how to find now, and a deep, quiet grief about that distance that he spoke of, with a careful restraint that told her he rarely spoke of it at all. She told him about her mother, who had died of fever when Olive was 12, and how she had stepped into a version of her mother's role in the store and the household so naturally that she sometimes wondered who she would have been if that hadn't happened, not bitterly, just curiously, the way you wonder about a road not taken. "Who are you, outside of the store and your father?" he asked. The question startled her with its directness. She thought about it seriously. "I like to draw," she said at last. "Mostly landscapes. I have notebooks full of drawings of the prairie and the sky. I read everything I can get my hands on. I order books through the store sometimes and read them before I put them on the shelf, which my father used to tease me about. I make good pie. I am better at mathematics than most men I've met, which they find disconcerting." She paused. "And I am lonelier than I let anyone see." The word hung in the air between them. She had not intended to say it. It was simply the most honest answer to his question. He was quiet for a long moment, and she was grateful that he didn't rush to fill the quiet with something reassuring and therefore false. "I know something about that kind of loneliness," he said at last. "The kind that's right beside other people all the time. The trail gives you men to ride with, but not someone who sees you," he said. "Yes." The second night on the trail, they camped beside the same creek draw they'd used on the way south. The stars came out the same way, enormous and unhurried, and the coyotes called to each other in the dark. But something was different now. The air between them had changed in a way that was impossible to miss. A warmth, a gravitational pull that hadn't been there at the start, or had been there, and had simply been unnamed. Olive sat by the fire longer than was practical, not wanting to retreat to her bedroll while there was still this feeling of the evening, this rare and specific quality of time she didn't want to let go of. Wesley sat across the fire from her, his hat in his hands, turning it in the unconscious way he did when he was thinking. "What happens when we get back to Abilene?" he asked. The question was careful, deliberate. "I go back to the store," she said. "The deed is secure now, so that's one worry resolved. There's always another." She looked at him across the firelight. "What happens to you?" "I had an offer from a ranch over in Ellsworth County," he said. "A foreman position. It's a big outfit." He paused. "I hadn't decided about it." "Why not?" He turned his hat one more time and then set it down on his knee and looked at her directly. "Because it would mean staying in one place, and I have been trying to convince myself for 3 years now that I don't want that." She felt her heartbeat change in a way she was not accustomed to, not fear, but something adjacent to it, something that required courage. "And now," he looked at her for a long time across the fire. "And now I'm less certain of what I want than I was a week ago," he said, "which should probably alarm me but doesn't." She did not look away from him, because she was not a woman who looked away from the truth. "It doesn't alarm me either," she said quietly. He nodded slowly, as if settling something inside himself. He didn't say anything more, and she didn't either, but she went to sleep that night with the warmth of those words held somewhere in her chest where she kept her most important things. They reached Abilene in the late afternoon of the following day. The town rising out of the prairie with its familiar sprawl of wooden buildings, and the distant sound of cattle, and the smell of dust and commerce that she had breathed her whole life. She had never been so glad to see it and so reluctant to arrive at the same time. Wesley rode with her all the way to the store, which she had expected him to do because it was the professional completion of what he'd been hired for. He helped her down from Juniper with a hand that he offered and she took, and the brief contact of their hands was completely ordinary and also, she admitted to herself, not ordinary at all. She paid him his $10. He took it and folded it and put it in his vest pocket, and then he stood there with his hat in his hands again, and she thought of all the things she could say and chose the honest one. "I hope you'll come into the store," she said, "before you make any decisions about Ellsworth County." He looked at her steadily. "I'll come in the morning," he said. She nodded and went inside, and she did not allow herself to watch him ride away, but she listened to the sound of his horse's hooves until they were gone. Her father was awake when she came in, sitting up in his chair with a blanket across his knees and looking more alert than he had in days. She sat beside him and told him everything: the clerk's obstruction, Gideon Hatch, the final resolution, every detail of the documents now safely back in the store's strongbox. He listened with his eyes bright and his expression moving through relief and pride in equal measure. "And the man you hired," he said when she was done. "Wesley Keene. He was excellent," she said. "Reliable and capable and good." Her father watched her face with the particular attention of a man who had known her for 24 years. "Good," he said, and didn't say anything else, and she was grateful for that too. Wesley came to the store the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. The first day he bought a length of rope and a tin of saddle soap, which she suspected he didn't urgently need. The second day he bought nothing, but asked if he could help her move several heavy sacks of flour that had been delivered, which she accepted because the sacks genuinely were heavy, and because watching him simply help, without theater, without expectation, was something she found herself wanting to be near. The third morning he came in while she was in the middle of a dispute with a farmer who was insisting she had overcharged him for seed corn. She had not overcharged him. She had her records and her receipts and her precise memory, and she was making her case with complete calm when the farmer, a large and red-faced man named Prentice, raised his voice at her in a way that was designed to intimidate. She did not step back. She held her position behind the counter and repeated the figures clearly and without apology. But she was aware of Wesley, who had come in partway through and was standing quietly near the door, not interfering, not performing, simply present. When Prentice finally looked at the receipt she put in front of him and saw that the figures were indisputably correct and backed down with a grumble and a departing look that was not exactly gracious, Wesley moved from the door to the counter with an expression of contained satisfaction. "You handled that perfectly," he said. "I handle it every time," she said, slightly flushed from the confrontation in spite of herself. Men like Prentice think the only thing a woman can do with an account book is use it as a doorstop. Men like Prentice are consistently surprised by the world, Wesley said, and she laughed, sudden and genuine, and he smiled at the sound of it with an openness that made her chest tighten sweetly. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that she recognized as something new in her life. Wesley had not taken the Ellsworth County position. He had, without announcing it as a particular decision, simply remained in Abilene. He found work helping a local ranch outfit with their spring organization and fence repair, work that kept him busy 5 days out of 7, but left him mornings that he reliably spent either at the store or, increasingly, sitting in the small kitchen behind the store where Olive made her coffee, and where her father, on better days, occupied the armchair and watched the interaction between his daughter and this quiet man with an expression of shrewd and private satisfaction. Her father liked Wesley. He asked him pointed questions about his family, his work history, his opinions on things, in the way that a man assesses another man he might someday entrust with something he values more than his own life. Wesley answered everything straight, without embellishment, and Edward Ramsey gave his verdict to Olive one morning when Wesley had stepped out to see to his horse. "That's a man who knows what he is," her father said. "Not many of those around." "No," she agreed, very carefully not looking at her father's expression. On a warm May evening, Wesley asked her to walk with him, and she took off her apron and put on her shawl, and they walked along the edge of town to where the prairie started, the grass high and moving in the evening wind. The sky was turning colors that had no names, deep rose and amber, and a particular shade of violet that Olive had tried to capture in her drawings and never quite managed. "I need to tell you something," he said, which made her heart do something complicated. They had stopped at the crest of a small rise that overlooked a sweep of open land, the sunset enormous and immediate ahead of them. "Tell me," she said. He turned to face her, and she could see that he was choosing his words with the same care he brought to everything. Not because he was uncertain about what he felt, she thought, but because he wanted to say it right. "I came to Abilene as a hired escort, and I am about to say something that is considerably outside the scope of that arrangement," he said, and there was that rare, faint smile. "I have been falling in love with you since the second day on the trail when you told me that you were lonelier than you let anyone see, and I have spent 6 weeks in Abilene failing to talk myself out of it. I don't want to talk myself out of it anymore." She stood very still in the prairie wind, her shawl moving, the sunset burning everything gold around them. She had known this was coming in the way you know a summer storm is coming before it arrives, the pressure building in the air, and she had spent 6 weeks of her own deciding what she wanted to do when it arrived. "Wesley," she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected, "I have been drawing you in my sketchbook for 3 weeks. Not because I particularly plan to, but because my hand keeps finding your outline. I think that probably means something." He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "May I?" And she stepped forward and said, "Yes." And he took her face in his hands with a gentleness that seemed almost at odds with the size and roughness of his hands and kissed her. It was quiet and sure, and it tasted like the open prairie, wide and unhurried and better than anything she had tried to imagine. And when it ended, they stood in the sunset with their foreheads almost touching, and neither of them said anything for a long moment because some things are clearer in silence than in language. "I don't want to go to Ellsworth County," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to stay here." She pulled back just enough to see his face, her hands on his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady under her palms. "Then stay," she said. He did. The summer that followed was the fullest Olive Ramsey could remember in years. She moved through her days with an efficiency she'd always had, but there was something warmer underneath it now, something that made the work lighter not because the work had changed, but because she had. Wesley came to the store every morning, and on days when she was particularly busy, he simply appeared behind the counter and helped without being asked, learning the organization of the shelves and the logic of the accounts with the same focused attention he applied to everything. She found herself glancing at him across the store and finding him already watching, both of them quickly looking back at their respective tasks with the small, private smiles of people who are still slightly amazed by what has happened to them. He met her father properly now, not as a hired man but as something more, and the two of them developed an odd and genuine friendship. Her father would call Wesley into his room on the better mornings, and they would talk about cattle and land and politics, the growing tensions over land rights in the territory, the changing economics of the cattle drives as the railroads expanded south and made the long trail drives less necessary. And Olive would listen from the doorway sometimes, mending or writing in her account books, watching her father's face animated and engaged in a way it hadn't been in months. "He's good for your father," Clara Hutchins said to Olive one afternoon at the post office, with the tone of a woman confirming something she'd suspected all along. "And I suspect he's good for you." "He is," Olive said simply. In August, on a hot, still evening when even the prairie wind had given up and the whole world smelled of dry grass and distant cattle, Wesley sat across the kitchen table from her father and asked permission to court Olive formally and to eventually ask her to be his wife. Her father told her about it afterward. Wesley hadn't told her himself, which she found touching in its old-fashioned correctness, as if the formality mattered to him as a way of honoring something he took seriously. "And what did you say?" she asked her father. "I said yes without hesitation," her father said. "And then I gave him about 15 minutes of unsolicited advice about you, which he listened to extremely politely," she laughed. "What kind of advice?" "That you will always manage the accounts better than him and he should let you. That you do not want to be protected from difficulty, you want to be stood beside through it. That your mother had the same quality and it was the best thing about her. He paused, and there was a shimmer of emotion in his eyes that he didn't try to hide. He already knew all of it, Olive. He said as much. He knows you. She had to press her lips together hard to keep her composure. Yes, she said, he does. Wesley asked her himself the following Sunday, not in the kitchen behind the store but out on the prairie again, because they had both come to associate that landscape with the most honest conversations of their lives. He had clearly thought about it carefully and chose a morning when the light was clear, and the air was cool and the grass was golden and moving, and he went down on one knee, which she hadn't expected and which made her laugh, and then immediately press her hand to her mouth because the laugh had come from joy and overwhelm together. He was holding a ring simple, a slender band of gold with a small turquoise stone, bought from the jeweler in town. He had chosen turquoise deliberately, he said, because it was the color of the creek water in the draw where they'd camped, where she had told him she was lonely, which was the moment he thought he'd begun to fall. Olive Ramsey, he said, steady as ever, his gray eyes clear. Will you marry me? Yes, Wesley, she said, without any hesitation at all. Yes. He slid the ring on her finger and stood, and she went into his arms and held on to him, the prairie air around them enormous and kind, and she thought about all the paths that had led from her father's letter to this exact moment. The land office, the wagon stuck in the mud, Gideon Hatch's dusty ranch, the firelight and the honest words, and she thought that if she had not been the kind of woman she was, if she had sent any other man on that errand, if she had tried to manage it by letter rather than going herself, none of this would exist. The thought filled her with a gratitude that had no adequate expression, so she simply held him tighter. They married in October. The ceremony was small because they both wanted small, the minister, her father in his best coat with more color in his face than he'd had in months, Clara Hutchins weeping cheerfully in the front row, Gideon Hatch, who had driven 70 miles specifically to attend, and who shook Wesley's hand afterward with an iron grip, and told Olive she'd done well. The afternoon light came through the church windows in long autumn slants and turned everything the color of honey. And when Wesley took her hand at the altar, his grip was the same as it had been when they'd shaken hands in the Drover's Rest, firm and steady and completely real. They spent their wedding night in the small apartment above the store that Olive had always occupied, and it was nothing like the grand hotels she'd occasionally read about in the novels she ordered, and nothing like the formal wedding suites in eastern cities. But it was entirely theirs, and it was exactly right. And in the morning Wesley made coffee and brought it to her in bed with the same matter-of-fact competence he brought to everything. And she sat up and took the cup and looked at him in the morning light and thought, "This is the life I was living toward. I did not know it was this, but it was always this." The autumn deepened into a Kansas winter, which was not gentle. The cold came off the plains in waves that cut through everything, and the work of the store intensified, because people needed supplies for the hard months ahead, and came in wanting credit they sometimes couldn't afford and decisions that required all her skill in managing accounts against compassion. Wesley helped her navigate the harder cases, not by taking over but by sitting beside her in the evenings when she worked through the books, offering a perspective that was different from hers and often useful, never insisting on his view but quietly persistent when he thought she'd missed something. Her father had a difficult winter. There were 3 weeks in January when he could barely leave his room, and Olive moved through those weeks with a controlled fear that she allowed herself to acknowledge only with Wesley, in the dark of the night, quietly. He held her while she talked and did not try to fix things that could not be fixed. He simply held her, which was precisely right. By February, her father was sitting up again, and by March, on a day when the first warm air came rolling back up from the south and the snow along the north side of the buildings began to drip in earnest, Edward Ramsey walked into his store under his own power for the first time in 4 months, and stood behind the counter with his hands on the wood, and breathed it all in with the expression of a man who has been given something back that he thought he'd lost. That spring, Olive discovered she was pregnant. She told Wesley on an evening in April, when the prairie was green again and the cattle drives were starting up from Texas, and the whole territory was in its annual fever of motion and new possibility. She told him simply and directly, the way she did everything, seated across from him at the kitchen table with the lamp between them. She watched his face go through something, a quick, complex progression from surprise to understanding to something she could only describe as light, as if someone had added fuel to the fire behind his eyes. He came around the table and took her hands and held them for a long time without speaking. When he looked up, his eyes were bright in a way she had never quite seen before. "Are you happy?" she asked, because she wanted to hear him say it. "Olive," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady, which on a man of his steadiness was extraordinary. "I didn't know I could be this happy." She had to swallow something large and warm. "Good," she said. "That's very good." They told her father that evening. Edward Ramsey sat in his armchair and heard the news and then pressed his hands over his face for a long moment in the way of a man who is trying to contain something too large. When he lowered them, he was composed, but his eyes were brilliant. "I want to see this child grow up," he said. "You will," Olive said firmly, and believed it. The pregnancy was uncomplicated in the physical sense, though the summer was brutally hot and running the store through it required all her considerable reserves of energy. Wesley absorbed more and more of the physical work, and she found ways to let him without surrendering any of the decision-making or the accounts, because they had both understood from the start that she was the one who understood the business, and he respected that without any complication. Clara Hutchins came by often, ostensibly to pick up supplies, actually to check on Olive with the blunt, affectionate surveillance of a woman who had decided to be interested in her welfare. The cattle trail past the Ramsey parcel, the land they had ridden to Caldwell to secure, proved its value that summer. 3 different outfits requested to use the parcel as a resting point for their herds, and Wesley negotiated reasonable terms with each of them, and the income was small but real and added to the store's growing stability. Olive sat with the accounts one evening and calculated that by next year they might be able to expand the store's dry goods section, which had been understocked for years due to supply cost. "We could put a proper reading section in the back corner," Wesley said, looking over her shoulder at her notes. "A reading section," she repeated. "Books. You order them and read them before they sell. We might as well make that corner respectable." He was smiling. "I think," she said, setting down her pen and looking up at him with something that was part amusement and part deep, uncomplicated love, "that I will add that to the ledger under quality of life investments." In November of 1874, their son was born. He arrived on a cold, clear night with a full moon throwing silver light across the prairie, and when the doctor placed him in Olive's arms, she looked at the small, astounding fact of him, dark-haired like Wesley, with her own green-gray eyes already apparent, and felt something so fundamental shift in her understanding of herself that she could not have described it in any language she had access to. Wesley, who had been allowed to remain nearby, came to the bedside and sat on its edge and looked at his son with an expression of such complete undone wonder that Olive, despite her exhaustion, felt her heart break open with love in the direction of this quiet man who gave almost nothing away and who was, at this moment, giving everything away. "What shall we call him?" she asked. They had discussed names for months. Wesley had said early on that he thought the naming should be hers, which she had told him was a lovely sentiment, but that they were doing it together. They had made a list and narrowed it and argued pleasantly about it, and had arrived at a short list of 3. "Edward," Wesley said, looking at the baby and then up at her, "for your father if you want." She had thought she was too tired to cry. She had been wrong about that. "Edward Wesley Keene," she said, and felt the name settle into place with the completeness of something exactly right. Her father, when they told him the next morning, sat very still for a moment with his hands folded in his lap. Then he said quietly, "I am a lucky man," and that was all, but it was sufficient. The winter of 1874 into 1875 was gentler than the one before it, or perhaps it only seemed so because the house above the store was fuller now. The sound of the baby, the particular busyness of caring for a new life, the way it reorganized everything around its simple, insistent needs. Olive discovered that she had a talent for motherhood that surprised her in its naturalness, not because she doubted herself, but because she hadn't expected it to feel so continuous with who she already was. She had always been organized, patient, devoted. These qualities translated. Wesley was besotted with his son in the way of men who have spent years being careful about attachment, and then find it has claimed them entirely without permission. He was up with the baby at night when the baby would not settle, walking the small room, singing songs that turned out to be old Missouri folk tunes that Olive had never heard, quiet and slightly off-key, and completely earnest, and she would lie in the warm dark and listen to his voice and feel so much contentment that it was almost an ache. In the spring, a man named Dillard came through Abilene looking to buy the general store. He was a Kansas City businessman, well-dressed and confident, with money from the railroad expansion and an eye for opportunity. He made Olive a very good offer, sitting across from her in the store with his hat in his lap and his figures laid out on the counter, and she listened to the whole thing with professional courtesy, and then told him the store was not for sale at any price, which she said pleasantly, but with the kind of absolute finality that left no room for negotiation. After he left, Wesley appeared from the back room where he'd been listening. She'd known he was there and leaned on the counter and looked at her. "You didn't even consider it." There was nothing to consider. "It was a good offer. This store is not just an investment," she said. "It is my father's life's work and my mother's home before she died and the place I have known for 24 years. You cannot buy something like that, not at any number." She paused. "Do you think I should have sold it?" "No," he said immediately. "I think you are exactly right. I just wanted to hear you say it." She laughed at him, which he received with equanimity. The summer of 1875 brought its heat, and its trail drives, and its complicated parade of humanity through Abilene. The railroad's expansion southward was already beginning to change the cattle trade. Ellsworth and Wichita were rising as trail destinations, and Abilene was starting to feel the shift. Some businesses struggled. The Ramsey store did not, partly because Olive had anticipated the change 2 years before it arrived and had expanded into farm supply and hardware, supplying the growing population of permanent settlers who were beginning to homestead the territory in greater numbers as the cattle era gradually gave way to farming. She was also, she realized in August, pregnant again. This time she told Wesley over supper, the same kitchen table, the same lamp, their son asleep upstairs. Wesley's response was the same contained, extraordinary brightness, but this time he also pulled her out of her chair and into his arms in the middle of the kitchen, standing there holding her for a long time, and she felt his heartbeat against her cheek, and thought that she would draw this later, this exact angle of lamplight, the warmth of his arms, the sound of the prairie night outside the window. Her father's health, which had stabilized, turned more uncertain that fall. The doctor was honest with them. The heart was weakening, and while there was no imminent crisis, the trajectory was clear. Her father himself faced this with a tranquility that she found both comforting and devastating, the tranquility of a man who has had a full life and understood it to be full. "I'll see the baby," he told her firmly. "You will," she said. "And then I will see it grow a while," he said, with less certainty but genuine hope. The baby, a girl this time, rosy and loud in a way that Edward had not been, fully engaged with the world from her first moment, was born in February of 1876, in the same room, on another cold night. They named her Frances, after Wesley's mother, which Olive suggested, and which made Wesley very quiet for several minutes in a way that was entirely eloquent. Frances Keene arrived in a household that had been waiting for her, and the household expanded around her with the ease of something simply becoming what it was always meant to be. Edward, now a year and a half and increasingly determined about everything, was fascinated by his sister in the way small children are fascinated by small animals, completely absorbed, reaching, sometimes too enthusiastic. Wesley ran interference between them with patient good humor, while Olive fed Frances and watched her family through the warm haze of new baby exhaustion, and thought that there was simply nothing better in the world than this room, these people, this life. Her father saw Frances, as he had promised. He held her with the careful expertise of a man who had held one baby before, decades ago, and his face had the quality of someone gathering something precious against the future. He died in April, on a mild spring morning when the first wildflowers were opening on the prairie. He died in his own room, in his own chair, with Olive holding his hand and Wesley standing behind her with his hands on her shoulders. He had been declining slowly for 2 weeks, and the end when it came was peaceful, which she was grateful for with a completeness that she would carry for the rest of her life. The grief was real and large, and she did not try to manage it into something smaller than it was. She cried when she needed to cry, and she worked when work was what she needed, and she let Wesley be present in whatever way was right for each moment, which he understood with an instinct that she thought must have come from loving her well enough to know her. He had a good life, Clara Hutchins said, at the small funeral, which was attended by half the town because Edward Ramsey had in fact been known and liked across 20 years of fair dealing and honest prices. He saw you well married and those 2 beautiful children. He did, Olive agreed. She ran the store through the summer of 1876 with the particular focus of someone channeling grief into purpose. The accounts were cleaner than they'd ever been. The new farm supply section was thriving. She hired a young woman named Ruth, recently arrived from Ohio with her husband who had homesteaded east of town, to help manage the counter so that Olive could spend more time with the children and the books, and Ruth turned out to be quick and reliable and made the daily operation considerably smoother. Wesley, meanwhile, had begun working with a local ranching outfit not as a trail hand but as a ranch manager, a position that used his knowledge of cattle and land without requiring long absences on the trail. He was home every evening by supper, which he had established from the beginning as something he was unwilling to sacrifice. The ranch owner, a pragmatic man named Whitfield, valued Wesley's ability to handle both the cattle work and the men who did it, and the arrangement was good for everyone. The territory around Abilene was changing visibly by 1876. The open range was giving way to farms, the wild grass to wheat fields, the long cattle drives to railroad shipping from new southern depots. The Kishom Trail itself was winding down, fewer herds pushing north, more cattle going east by rail from Texas. The era was shifting, and Abilene, which had been the wildest of Wild West cattle towns for a handful of years, was becoming something quieter, more permanent, more domestic. Olive watched this change with a complex feeling. The romance of the old era was real. She had felt it in her own way, on the trail to Caldwell in the spring that had changed her life. The enormous sky and the open grass and the sense of a world still being figured out. But the new thing also had its own beauty. The farm spreading across the prairie, families putting down roots, children going to school. A longer life than the cattle trail offered, if a less mythic one. She talked about this with Wesley one evening in the long Kansas twilight, sitting on the small porch they had added to the back of the store building, watching Edward chase something small through the yard, a grasshopper or a sparrow, with the single-minded joy of a 3-year-old, while Frances sat in Wesley's lap eating a piece of bread with absolute concentration. "Do you miss it?" she asked. The trail, he thought about it, which she had learned was always how he answered things, genuinely, not reflexively. "I miss the particular feeling of it," he said at last, "the scale of it. Riding into a sunrise with 2,000 longhorns moving in front of you, there's nothing quite like it, and there won't be for much longer. That time is ending." He looked down at Frances, who had finished the bread and was now examining his vest buttons with scientific interest. "But I don't miss what it cost, the distance. The not belonging to anyone. You belong to us, she said. I know. His voice was simple and full. That's the thing. In the fall of 1877, two things happened that between them shaped the next chapter of their life. The first was that Olive received an offer to purchase the parcel of land near Caldwell, the same parcel she had ridden 70 miles to secure, from an investor who wanted to build a holding operation there. The offer was substantial. She spent several evenings with the accounts, and then took a single afternoon to ride out to the parcel itself, alone on Juniper, who was gray at the muzzle now but still steady. She stood on that particular piece of Kansas earth and looked at the horizon in every direction, the same horizon she had seen on that spring journey 4 years ago that had started everything. And she thought about the letter that had arrived blood-stained and smelling of horse sweat, and the man she'd found in the corner of the saloon, and the 2 days of open trail, and the firelight and the honest words. She thought about all of it, and then she rode back to Abilene and told the investor the parcel was not for sale. Wesley, when she told him, nodded. "Good," he said, "keep it." "I thought about leasing it to a homesteader instead," she said. "A family, let someone farm it. The income would be modest but steady, and at least it would be alive." "I know a family," he said. "The Herrera family over in Caldwell. They're looking for land. Good people, honest workers. Their eldest boy is about 20, hard worker." "Tell them," she said. The second thing that happened that fall was that Olive was offered a position on the newly forming Abilene Town Council, specifically on the Commerce Committee, which needed someone with genuine understanding of trade and accounts. The man who extended the offer, the town's new mayor, did so with the slightly uncomfortable air of a person doing something that he knew was right, but that the territory of 1877 did not widely endorse. Women on town councils were not common, and in Abilene not precedented. She accepted immediately. Wesley responded to this news by looking at her for a long moment and then saying with complete sincerity, "I want to tell you that this is unsurprising and entirely correct, and also that I feel considerable personal pride in your direction, which I suspect you don't require, but I want to say anyway." She kissed him. "I require it somewhat," she admitted. The work on the Commerce Committee was interesting and often frustrating in equal measure. She was the only woman in the room and made herself indispensable through the pure quality of her contributions to the discussion, which was the only available strategy and happened to be one she was well equipped for. The other committee members, most of whom had begun with visible reservations, gradually reorganized their reservations into a somewhat grudging respect that hardened over the months into something genuine. By the spring of 1878, they were consulting her first on questions of trade policy and market pricing, and the grudging part had largely fallen away. She wrote letters to other businesswomen she'd heard of through her suppliers and her reading women in Wichita, in Topeka, in Dodge City, who were running operations and navigating the same invisible walls she navigated, and she got letters back, and those letters were a specific kind of sustenance. The knowledge that you are not alone in a difficulty does not remove the difficulty, but it makes you larger in relation to it. The children grew. Edward became a serious, watchful boy who asked questions that frequently required Olive to look things up, which she did gladly, because curiosity was the quality she prized most in a person. Francis was his absolute opposite in temperament, loud where he was quiet, physical where he was contemplative, charging at the world where he observed it. Both of them had Wesley's steady quality underneath their different expressions of it, and both of them had Olive's precision with language, which they used at different volumes. Watching them together was the most reliably entertaining thing in Olive's life. By 1879, the store had been expanded once and was profitable enough to allow them to hire a second full-time employee. They had the parcel land leased to the Herrera family, who had built a modest homestead on it and were doing well. They had enough saved that Olive had invested in a small interest in the railroad shipping operations that were now defining the Kansas economy, which was proving a sound decision. The town around them was becoming something recognizable as permanent. A church with a real roof, a schoolhouse that Edward had recently begun attending, a newspaper that came out twice a week and sometimes managed to be accurate. One evening in early June, with the long summer light still flooding the kitchen and the children asleep upstairs and the sound of the prairie drifting in through the open window, Olive sat at the kitchen table with her sketchbook. She had kept the habit throughout all of it, drawing and drawing, the land and the sky and the life around her, and she was working on a drawing of Wesley's hands. He was sitting across from her, reading a newspaper, unaware. His hands were flat on the table on either side of the paper, rough from years of outdoor work, strong, completely familiar to her. She had drawn them before, but she kept drawing them because they kept being interesting to her. The hands that had built fires on the prairie, helped a wagon out of the mud, held their children for the first time, taken her face with such care in the sunset. He glanced up from the paper and saw what she was doing and was quiet for a moment. "You're drawing my hands again," he said. "You have interesting hands," she said, not looking up. "You've said that before. It continues to be true." He set the paper down and looked at her in the warm evening light with the expression he had that was just for her, not the smile exactly, but the thing behind the smile, the full, deliberate regard of a man who looks at his life and finds it more than he dared to imagine. "Olive," he said. She looked up. "I want you to know," he said, with the same care he'd always brought to important things, "that this is the life I would have chosen if I had known enough to choose it. All of it. The store and the town and your father's memory and these children and your drawings and you." She set down her pencil. The summer evening moved around them, warm and easy. "I know," she said, which was not insufficient. It was, in fact, everything. She reached across the table and he turned his hand over and she put hers in it. And they sat like that in the June light with the prairie breathing outside the window and their children sleeping above them, and the whole of their shared life spread around them like good country, honest and wide and thoroughly known. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full, not without difficulty, because difficulty was simply part of the landscape, but with the specific richness of a life that has found its shape. Abilene continued to change, as Kansas continued to change, as the West itself continued to change. The cattle era completed its transition. The railroad knit everything together differently. The territory opened more formally to settlement, and the population spread across the land in ways that made it look, from a distance, less wild and more human. But on the prairie on a clear day, which Olive made a point of walking out to regularly, the sky was still the same sky, still that enormous, nameless blue that no drawing had ever quite captured, and the grass still moved the same way in the wind, and it was still possible to stand in the middle of it and feel the full scale of the world, and know that you were a small thing in a large place, which was not humbling so much as clarifying. In 1881, when Edward was 7 and Frances 5, and the store was the most established business on Cedar Street, and the Commerce Committee had 3 other women on it now because Olive had been quietly persistent about that for 4 years, Wesley came home from the ranch one October afternoon with a particular kind of light in his eyes. "Whitfield's selling," he said, meaning the ranch. "He's moving back east. His wife wants Boston." Olive set down the account she was working on and gave him her full attention. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we have enough saved," he said, "that we could buy a share of the ranch, partner with whoever takes Whitfield's place if they'll have it." Or he paused and she could see him deciding whether to say the larger thing. "Or buy it outright. It's modest as ranches go. Good land, good cattle, well established. It would be ours." She looked at him for a long time, calculating. She had the figures nearly immediately. She always had the figures, and she ran them against the store's income and the railroad investment and the land lease revenue and the family's reserves. She turned the numbers over carefully and looked at their life from the outside, which she was good at, and then looked at Wesley's face, which told her everything about what he wanted and also which she valued, that he would accept her judgment if the numbers weren't right. The numbers were almost right. We'd need a partner for the first 2 years, she said, or a bank loan, which I'd prefer to avoid. Do you know anyone? He thought. Hatch, he said. She blinked. Gideon Hatch from Caldwell. He's been looking for an investment. I've been in correspondence with him. He respects you, he said so specifically when I wrote. He wants to put money into something solid. Wesley paused. He also said, and I'm quoting directly, that any woman who rides 70 miles to protect her family's land and wins is someone he'd trust with his. She thought about the old man with his iron grip and his 15 years of Kansas survival and his statement to the land office clerk, and she felt something that was warmly continuous with the woman she'd been in that Caldwell land office, frightened and determined in equal measure, refusing to be smaller than the situation required. Write him, she said. They wrote. Gideon Hatch, now in his late 70s but apparently no less sharp, came to Abilene in November and sat across from Olive and Wesley at the kitchen table, and examined the proposal in the same meticulous way he had examined her father's deed 8 years before, and then he set the papers down and said, "Done." The Keene Ranch, they called it by the family name without ceremony, became a real operation by the spring of 1882. It was modest, as Wesley had said, but it was theirs completely within 2 years when Gideon Hatch, fully repaid and apparently delighted with the return, signed his share over to them as a wedding gift for Edward Wesley Keene, and whatever wife the boy might eventually find, in honor of the marriage that had followed the land dispute that had, in his words, been the most productive land dispute he'd ever witnessed. Olive wrote Gideon Hatch a letter that took her 3 drafts to get right, because the simple thank you was true but insufficient for what she actually felt, which was a gratitude that connected backward through time to a Muddy Creek bank, and a land office clerk, and a blood-stained letter, and a quiet man in the corner of a saloon who had stood up when she came to his table, which was how he'd been raised, which told her everything. The ranch and the store ran as parallel enterprises, complementary rather than competing, with Wesley managing the cattle operation and Olive managing the store, and both of them working on the accounts together in the evenings, with Francis on Olive's knee and Edward doing his schoolwork at the other end of the table, with the intense focus of a boy who had his mother's precision and his father's quiet stubbornness. The synergy was practical ranch supplies bought from the store customers, who were ranchers getting a reliable personal connection to the Keene operation, and it was also simply the right shape for their particular life, which had always required 2 people who were fully themselves, rather than one person diminished to accommodate the other. Summer of 1883 brought a drought that tested the ranch badly. 3 months of insufficient rain, the grass going brown and sparse, the cattle needing to be moved and managed with care and constant attention. Wesley rode long days and came home with dust in every crease of his face and a tiredness that sat in his bones, but he managed the operation with exactly the measured, persistent competence that had always been his most distinctive quality. Olive managed the store's supply chain through the drought, which was its own complicated problem, farmers desperate for credit, suppliers raising prices, the balance between compassion and fiscal survival requiring her best judgment every week. They came through it. Not easily, not without loss. They sold a portion of the cattle herd at the end of August, which was painful, and 2 of the homestead farms that the store supplied went under and the families moved on, which was worse. But they came through with the ranch intact and the store solvent and a clarified understanding of exactly what they could withstand. "I want to plant a kitchen garden," Olive said, one evening in September when the drought had finally broken and the first real rain in months was falling outside the window, dark and steady and smelling of everything they'd been waiting for. "A proper one behind the ranch house. I want to grow things." He looked at her in a way that understood the meaning underneath the words, The desire for something that grows by your own hand, that feeds your family, that you can put your hands in the earth for. Then we'll plant one, he said. The garden the following spring was extraordinary, not because Olive was a natural gardener. She was not. She had to learn it laboriously and made considerable mistakes, but because she applied to it the same thorough, persistent attention she applied to everything. And by midsummer there were tomatoes and squash and beans and rows of greens, and a corner of sunflowers that she planted for no practical reason, except that she found them beautiful and thought beauty was a practical reason. Frances took to the garden with a passion that surprised them all. At 8 years old, she was already more knowledgeable about the plants than Olive, having an instinctive feel for soil and water and growth that she certainly hadn't inherited from either parent, but which both parents encouraged with absolute enthusiasm. She spent mornings in the garden before school and afternoons after it, and came to supper with earth on her hands that she had usually half removed and dirt under her nails that she hadn't bothered with, and looked so completely herself in those moments that Olive felt the particular joy of watching a child discover who they are. Edward, meanwhile, had decided he wanted to be a lawyer. He was 10 years old, and this was not a casual announcement. He had thought about it with serious deliberateness, and presented his reasoning to his parents at supper one evening with the organized logic of someone who had been listening to his mother argue accounts and property rights and trade policy his whole life. Wesley, who had been watching his son present this case, had looked at Olive across the table with an expression of such delighted recognition. There you are in him, exactly you, that she'd had to focus very hard on her plate. Then you will study for it, she told Edward, and I will get you the books you need. She ordered them through the store and read them before she put them on the shelf, which remained her habit, and which Wesley still teased her about, and which remained entirely and pleasurably true. In 1885, on the occasion of their 12th wedding anniversary, Wesley brought her out to the prairie in the long October light. Their place, the same rise above the same sweep of country where they had first said the real things to each other, and stood beside her in the golden afternoon air, with everything they had built spread around them in every direction. The town visible to the north, the ranch land rolling east, the trail south that still held in its dust the memory of a different October, a blood-stained letter, a first journey. 12 years, he said, and whatever's left of them, she said. He took her hand. She leaned against his shoulder. The wind moved through the prairie grass with the ancient, comfortable patience of something that will still be here when everything else has changed, and the sky above them was the same nameless blue it had always been, and the light was exactly as it had always been, turning everything it touched to something better than gold. I think your father would be proud, he said. I think so too, she said. And your mother, and Gideon Hatch wherever he is. They had received a letter the previous spring informing them that Gideon Hatch had died peacefully at his ranch outside Caldwell, aged 82, having reportedly spent his last years in a state of comfortable satisfaction, and having requested that his grave be on the boundary line of his property, because he wanted to know where the edges were even in eternity. The letter had made Olive laugh and cry simultaneously, which she had found to be an appropriate response. It's a good life, Wesley said. Not asking. It is the best life, she said, and this was completely, verifiably true, and they both knew it, and the prairie moved around them in the late afternoon light as if agreeing. The years continued to be good. Edward went east to study law at 17, which was a leaving that cost Olive more than she had anticipated, and which she managed by writing him long, detailed letters full of advice and news, and the occasional drawing of the ranch, and the prairie that she knew he would understand as what it was, her way of keeping him close while letting him go. He wrote back with the same regularity and the same thoroughness, and his letters were so unmistakably himself precise, curious, warm underneath the precision, that she could hear his voice in every sentence. Frances remained at the ranch. which surprised no one who knew her. And by the time she was 15, she was managing a significant portion of the kitchen garden and had begun to experiment with other crops, corresponding with an agricultural extension office in Topeka about soil management and drought-resistant varieties in a way that was impressively technical, and which Wesley read with undisguised admiration. She would make her own life on this land, Olive thought, in her own particular way, and the thought was all joy. And on an evening in the late summer of 1888, when the children were grown and the ranch was strong, and the store was the most established enterprise in Abilene, and the sky outside the ranch house window was the same impossible Kansas purple it turned every August sunset, Olive Ramsey Keene sat at the kitchen table with her sketchbook and drew her husband's face. He was 55 now, gray in his dark hair and more lines in his face, but the lines were the right kind, the lines of a man who had lived outdoors and loved honestly and worked hard and spent a great portion of his years smiling at his wife. He was reading, which was what he did in the evenings now, and his hat was on the table beside him, which was what he'd always done with it. This habit she had noticed from the very first evening in the Drover's Rest, 12 years before the marriage and 15 years before this moment. She drew the lines of his face and the angle of the lamplight and the particular way he held a book, which was with both hands as if he was taking it seriously. And she thought about a blood-stained letter and a spring prairie and a creek draw under the stars, and all the particular moments that had added up to this life, this kitchen, this man. He glanced up from his book and saw her drawing and smiled, the real smile, the one she'd first seen on the road back from helping the Carvers with their wagon that had changed his face completely. "Are you drawing me again? You are a consistently interesting subject," she said. "You've been saying that for 15 years. It continues to be true." He set the book down and looked at her across the table in the lamplight, and it was the same look he had always given her, the full, deliberate regard, nothing held back, all of him present and accounted for and exactly where he chose to be. "Olive," he said. She set down the pencil. The prairie night settled around the house, vast and familiar and kind. "I know," she said, because she always knew, because they had always understood each other in that deep way that takes years to build and becomes, once built, as natural as breathing. He reached across the table and she put her hand in his, the turquoise ring catching the lamplight, still on her finger after 15 years, still the exact right color of that creek water in August. And the Kansas sky outside the window turned from purple to the deepest, most extraordinary blue, and held there full and still, like something complete.